There is one night I can still remember very clearly. I was sitting on the bathroom floor, not because something dramatic had happened, but because the cold tiles somehow made me feel steady. My phone was in my hand, and I was scrolling through months of conversations. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for what I was seeing. I simply looked at the pattern. Every conversation had begun because of me. Every single one. I was the one who broke the silence, sent the first message, checked in, followed up, offered warmth, and kept trying to hold the connection together. Seeing all those conversations in one place made something inside me change. It wasn't exactly sadness. It was something heavier. It felt like grieving the realization that underneath all my effort was a quiet hope that if I kept showing up long enough, eventually they would turn around and choose to show up for me too. I had convinced myself that consistency could eventually unlock something in them. Maybe if I loved them with enough patience, communicated gently enough, and stayed available without asking for too much, things would finally change. Maybe one day they would be the person who reached out first. Maybe they would notice when I disappeared, feel the distance, and want to close it. That kind of hope can become incredibly strong because it makes you believe your next action might finally create the response you've been waiting for. But after living through this kind of dynamic myself, and hearing similar stories from so many others, I started seeing that we are often asking ourselves the wrong question. We keep asking what message will make a distant person initiate, what behavior will make them miss us, or what approach will finally convince them to come closer. Those questions make sense because when someone pulls away, your mind naturally looks for both an explanation and a solution. You begin thinking there must be a perfect combination of words, timing, patience, affection, silence, or distance that will somehow produce the response you want. But look closely at what is happening beneath those questions. You are still trying to manage another person's behavior. You are searching for the strategy that will make them move toward you, and that can keep you locked inside the same exhausting cycle. Instead of asking what you need, you're constantly studying what they need. Instead of seeing what the relationship is actually giving you, you're calculating your next move. Eventually, the question has to become different. It becomes less about how to make them reach for you, and more about why you keep waiting for someone who isn't reaching. And this is where things begin to get interesting. Attachment research gives us an important way to understand this pattern. Certain avoidant attachment patterns are often described through what researchers call deactivating strategies. These are automatic psychological responses that can help a person push down attachment needs, reduce emotional dependence, and create distance when closeness begins to feel uncomfortable. The key word here is automatic. These reactions are not always conscious decisions. When an avoidantly attached person's attachment system becomes activated, emotional closeness itself can start to feel threatening. The more important the relationship becomes, the stronger the urge to create distance can sometimes become. From the outside, this can be incredibly confusing. You may be offering affection, patience, reassurance, and understanding, while the other person seems to experience growing closeness as something they need to escape, rather than something they can simply enjoy. For many people with strong avoidant tendencies, these reactions can be connected to early experiences where emotional needs were not consistently welcomed, understood, or answered. A child who repeatedly learns that showing vulnerability brings dismissal, rejection, emotional distance, or disappointment may eventually stop showing those needs openly. The child adapts. They learn to depend on themselves, minimize their feelings, and stop expecting comfort from others. What once helped them survive an emotionally difficult environment can later become an automatic pattern inside adult relationships. That doesn't mean every avoidant person experienced the same childhood, and it doesn't mean attachment can be explained by one simple reason. But it can help explain why closeness sometimes activates defenses that seem completely unreasonable from the outside. And this is where the situation becomes especially painful for the person who genuinely loves them. You may be trying your best to be patient. You may communicate respectfully, give them space, offer affection, and work hard to make the relationship feel emotionally safe. Yet their inner system may not experience all that warmth as simple safety. A part of them may interpret increasing closeness as pressure, emotional risk, or a threat to their independence. That does not automatically mean you are actually pressuring them. It may mean their internal alarm system has learned to connect intimacy with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. Stay with this part, because this distinction can completely change the way you understand what has been happening. Understanding that difference took me a long time because I kept turning their withdrawal into a judgment about myself. I thought their distance meant I wasn't loving them correctly. I thought maybe I was too emotional, too available, too caring, or somehow not enough. Eventually, I started seeing something that changed the way I interpreted everything. Another person's defense mechanism is not automatically a measurement of the value of your love. Their inability to receive closeness does not instantly prove that your love was wrong, weak, or unwanted. But there is another part of this story that matters just as much, and that is time. What happens over time isn't only about what the distant person is doing. Something is changing inside you too. There is a progression, and somewhere inside that progression is a point where the entire dynamic can begin to shift. Most people look for that turning point in the other person's behavior. They wait for the message, the confession, the sudden realization, or the moment when the other person finally becomes emotionally open. They watch for some dramatic sign that everything has changed. But the deeper turning point often begins somewhere completely different. It begins when you stop arranging your behavior around producing a specific reaction from them. That is the moment the dynamic starts losing its old power over you. To understand why this matters, we need to look at what often comes first. The first stage is what I would call the performance stage. This is the stage where you begin shaping yourself around another person's emotional limitations. Maybe you're already there. Maybe you've experienced it before and somehow keep finding yourself back in the same place. You become extremely observant. You learn their habits, remember their moods, notice how long they normally take to respond, and begin calculating how much closeness might be too much. You become softer, more flexible, and increasingly careful about how you communicate your own needs. You tell yourself you're simply learning how to understand them. You start researching avoidant attachment, watching videos about emotional regulation, reading about nervous system responses, and studying relationship patterns. None of that is automatically bad. Understanding psychology can genuinely help. The problem begins when knowledge turns into another way of constantly adjusting yourself so the other person never has to experience discomfort. You start measuring every interaction before it even happens. Should I text first? Should I wait? Was that message too emotional? Did I show too much interest? Should I pull away now? Maybe they need more space. Maybe I should act less interested. Maybe if I stop asking questions, they will finally come closer by themselves. Slowly, the relationship stops feeling like something you simply experience and starts feeling like something you have to manage. Your attention moves away from your own emotional world and becomes focused on monitoring theirs. You begin treating their comfort as the main condition that decides whether the connection can survive. And because you are constantly adjusting yourself, you might even believe you're becoming more understanding, patient, or emotionally mature. But underneath that patience, something else can quietly happen. You may begin silencing yourself so often that you stop recognizing the difference between healthy understanding and giving up your own needs. You tell yourself you're being patient when you're actually waiting. You call it giving space when you're actually afraid to ask for more. You call it understanding when you're slowly disappearing from the relationship. And that is why the performance stage can become so draining. You're not simply loving someone anymore. You're constantly performing the version of yourself you believe they can tolerate. You're constantly trying to figure out the safest version of yourself for them. You watch your words, your timing, your emotional intensity, and even the expectations you allow yourself to have. You become scared that asking for too much will make them disappear, while asking for too little leaves you emotionally empty. So you compromise again. You wait a little longer. You send one more gentle message. You tell yourself they're simply overwhelmed. You explain their silence through everything you've learned about attachment. Eventually, understanding them becomes easier than facing what their behavior is actually doing to you. And that is where the trap begins. You can become so absorbed in understanding why someone behaves the way they do that you stop asking whether the relationship, exactly as it exists right now, is truly giving you what you need. The deeper transformation starts when you stop confusing compassion with endless self-sacrifice. You can understand why someone pulls away without deciding that you have to accept that distance forever. You can recognize their attachment patterns without taking responsibility for fixing them. You can understand their fear of closeness while still honoring your own need for consistency, affection, reciprocity, and emotional presence. Both realities can exist at the same time. Their past may help explain their behavior, but an explanation does not automatically make that behavior healthy or sustainable for you. Once you truly understand that difference, your attention begins to move away from trying to make a distant person choose you and toward a far more important question. What kind of relationship am I actually willing to be part of? And what changes when I stop performing for someone else's emotional availability? That is where the real shift begins. Not when you discover the perfect message, not when you learn the perfect amount of distance, not when you finally discover a trick that makes someone afraid of losing you. The change begins when you stop allowing their response to become the final judgment of your worth. You stop thinking that one more effort will finally prove you are lovable enough to be chosen. You start observing instead of chasing. You pay attention to actions instead of building your future around someone's potential. You allow their behavior to give you information instead of immediately turning that behavior into another problem you must solve. And strangely enough, this is often when the entire dynamic starts to feel different. Not because you've finally figured out how to control them, but because you've started taking back control of the one person whose behavior you can actually influence: yourself. Stay with me, because this is where the real change becomes visible. You genuinely begin wanting to become someone whose presence feels safe and comfortable enough for the other person to move toward. And there is something deeply honest about that desire. When you love someone, it is natural to want to understand what helps them feel secure, especially when you know emotional closeness is difficult for them. There is nothing wrong with approaching someone with patience, kindness, and compassion. But there is a pattern that can slowly form between two people, without either person consciously choosing it. One person reaches toward connection, while the other feels an increasing need for space. Then that withdrawal causes the first person to reach even harder. The more one person moves forward, the more the other person steps backward, and the cycle begins feeding itself. Neither person necessarily wakes up wanting to create this pattern. Yet each person's attempt to protect and regulate themselves can accidentally become the exact thing that activates the other person's defenses. This is often known as the pursue-withdraw cycle, where one person's protest behavior and the other's distancing response repeatedly strengthen each other. You look for reassurance because you sense distance, and they create even more distance because your increased pursuit feels like emotional pressure. Then their withdrawal makes you more uncertain, which causes you to seek even more reassurance. Before long, both people are reacting to each other's coping strategies instead of responding to the actual relationship that exists between them. And I want you to understand something very important. Your love did not create their avoidant attachment. You are not responsible for defenses that were developed long before you entered their life. But repeated pursuit can sometimes keep the environment around those defenses activated. Without intending to, you may be reinforcing what their nervous system already expects. That closeness will bring demands. That intimacy means pressure. That emotional connection requires them to prepare for discomfort instead of simply experiencing safety. Then you enter the second stage, which I think of as depletion. This is the point where all that effort starts taking a real emotional price from you. In the beginning, you may hardly notice it. You simply feel slightly more tired, slightly more anxious, and a little less emotionally stable. But eventually, the exhaustion becomes impossible to overlook. It isn't the kind of tiredness that disappears after one peaceful night of sleep. It's the deeper exhaustion that comes from constantly watching yourself. You've spent so much time thinking about what they might feel, how they might respond, and what could make them pull away, that you slowly lose contact with your own natural reactions. You know exactly when their tone changes. You know what their silence usually means. You can recognize their distancing patterns almost immediately. You've become extremely good at reading them. But somewhere during that process, you stop checking in with yourself, and that realization can hurt more than you expect. You may eventually notice that you've been filtering your personality for so long that being completely natural around them feels strangely unfamiliar. You soften your requests before you even say them. You lower your expectations before expressing them. You convince yourself that wanting consistency is somehow unreasonable because you understand that they struggle with intimacy. For someone with strong avoidant patterns, developing a greater ability to tolerate intimacy usually requires repeated experiences where closeness does not automatically lead to losing independence, overwhelming demands, or emotional punishment. Safety is developed slowly. It can involve learning to move closer to someone without feeling trapped, becoming vulnerable without immediately running away, and discovering that connection does not have to destroy independence. But their healing cannot be carried by their partner. That responsibility belongs to them. What you can control is how you participate in the relationship. You can approach without chasing. You can give someone room without turning that space into abandonment. You can communicate warmth without repeatedly asking them to prove they care. You can stay emotionally present without making yourself available every second. There is a way to love someone that doesn't require you to constantly run after them. It feels steady instead of frantic. It stays open without becoming desperate. It offers connection without turning connection into pressure. And the biggest difference isn't always obvious from the outside. Two people can perform exactly the same action while having completely different reasons for doing it. You can give someone space because you're trying to make them miss you, or you can give them space because you respect their independence while also refusing to abandon yourself. You can send a loving message because you genuinely want to express your feelings, or you can send that same message because you're secretly hoping it will finally create the reaction you've been waiting for. From the outside, those two actions may look exactly the same. Inside, however, they are completely different experiences. Your nervous system can sense the difference between acting from fear and acting from inner stability. That is why reclaiming yourself matters so much. The goal isn't to become perfect at relationship techniques. The goal is to stop living in a constant state where every action is secretly designed to create a specific response from another person. There is also an important physical and emotional side to this. Long-term stress can influence how people experience closeness, bonding, and emotional connection. When someone's nervous system has spent years functioning under high levels of stress, experiences that should feel comforting may sometimes feel unfamiliar, overwhelming, or even uncomfortable. The body can learn patterns just as the mind does, and when that happens, a person may instinctively move away from the very connection they consciously say they want. The body does not automatically recognize closeness as safe, simply because the situation is objectively safe. The nervous system learns through repeated experiences. If intimacy has previously been connected with pressure, arguments, criticism, rejection, or a loss of personal freedom, then even sincere affection can initially trigger defensive reactions. This is why you cannot simply make yourself more available and expect another person's inner alarm system to suddenly shut down. You cannot force someone to feel safe. What you can control is whether you keep increasing the pressure around the relationship by chasing, over-explaining, checking constantly, or trying to force a specific outcome. And that brings us to another stage, one I think of as arrival. But arrival is important because it may not look anything like the dramatic transformation you've been imagining. It doesn't always start with a huge confession, a perfect declaration of love, or someone suddenly becoming emotionally open overnight. Sometimes arrival looks surprisingly simple. It may be a message that actually has meaning instead of another empty check-in. It could be them finally acknowledging something they once avoided talking about. It might be an apology that doesn't hide behind excuses, or it could simply be a moment when they initiate contact because they genuinely want to connect, rather than because you created the situation and pulled them back in. You will feel the difference because the energy behind their action will be different. It won't feel like another tiny breadcrumb meant to keep the connection barely alive. It will feel like a conscious step toward you, even if some part of them is still uncomfortable with vulnerability. And that distinction matters more than you may realize. Real movement toward intimacy does not require fear to disappear completely. Someone can still feel nervous about closeness and choose to move toward it anyway. They may still need personal space. They may still have moments when their old defenses return. The difference is that they begin taking responsibility for what happens after that. They stop leaving you to carry the entire relationship. They begin initiating, communicating, repairing, explaining, and participating. Their actions start showing that connection is becoming something they are willing to actively create, instead of something they simply receive whenever you do all the work to make it possible. Arrival does not mean perfection, it means reciprocity. It is the point where you no longer have to manufacture every chance for connection, because the other person has finally started creating some of those chances themselves. What is often described as earned secure attachment is essentially the gradual development of healthier relationship patterns through repeated, intentional experiences of consistency and emotional safety. Someone who has spent years depending on avoidant defenses can slowly learn another way of relating when they genuinely take part in that process. Over time, they may become more comfortable saying something is wrong instead of disappearing. They may learn to ask what someone actually means rather than immediately assuming criticism or rejection. They may become more capable of expressing what they feel without preparing themselves for humiliation, conflict, or punishment. These changes can happen. People are capable of developing more secure ways of relating. But there is one boundary here that matters enormously. Another person cannot create that transformation for them. You can offer kindness, you can offer patience, you can provide understanding and emotional safety. But you cannot make someone choose the inner work required to become more secure. And I want you to hear this next part without turning it into another reason to blame yourself. If someone with avoidant patterns hasn't been initiating contact, that does not automatically mean you are not lovable enough. It doesn't mean you used the wrong words, cared too much, cared too little, gave too much space, or failed to become the perfect partner for their emotional system. You could have been patient, emotionally mature, deeply understanding and genuinely loving, and they could still struggle to move closer to you. Some people with avoidant patterns truly care about the people they become attached to. Their difficulty isn't always a lack of emotion. Sometimes the deeper issue is their ability to tolerate those feelings and express them inside a close relationship. That internal struggle belongs to them. Their attachment defenses, fears, emotional habits, and willingness to work through those patterns are part of their own journey. You can walk beside someone, but you cannot walk the entire path for them. And this is why the most important work is not learning another trick to make them contact you. It isn't discovering the perfect text, becoming more mysterious, calculating the exact amount of silence, or figuring out precisely how much affection their nervous system can handle. The deeper work is creating a life that still feels meaningful, even if they never move toward you in the way you once hoped they would. Stay with me, because this is where the focus has to come back to you.